Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Acid Horizon. I am Craig, your host. Before we begin our episode with Jules Joanne Gleeson, just a few things. Acid Horizon Studios is moving. Yes, I am leaving Los Angeles, California, and moving to some new rural environs. This is going to allow me to develop new content, and more podcasts for our supporters. Speaking of which, you could support Acid Horizon for less than $5 for the rest of the year. That's right, subscribe at the $1 level, and that's just $1 a month until January. And that's going to allow you to participate in our seminar this month with Jeremy R. Smith, as we discuss an essay that Jeremy recently translated by philosopher Francois Laruelle. We would love to see you in that seminar. So now let's welcome our guest, Jules Joanne Gleeson, as we raise the question, how do gender transitions happen? Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, myself, Will, and Adam have the privilege of being joined by Jules Joanne Gleeson, a theorist, comedian, historian, and contributor to the recent Transgender Marxism collection, which she co-edited with fellow theorist and political economist Elle O'Rourke. Jules joins us today not only to discuss the project of Transgender Marxism as a collection that articulates the necessary interrelations between transliberation and the abolition of capitalism, but also to discuss one of her own essays within the text itself on the registers of identity formation and symbolic recoding that are invoked to answer the question, how do gender transitions happen? Jules, welcome to Acid Horizon.
Hello, so lovely to join you all.
Before we begin, there's something that we need to address, which was the recent debacle with the online publication of The Guardian and your interview with Judith Butler. And for folks who don't know about that, we're not going to rehash the whole thing. You can find that online, but perhaps you can give us a little bit of a debrief where you're at both emotionally, professionally, and what your standing is with all the parties involved in that.
Yeah, so I guess debacle is the right word for it. Although in a way, the episode kind of brought at least Judith Butler's viewpoint to a much wider audience, which
yes,
I'm very welcome for through the power of memes and the so-called Barbra Streisand effect. So for people who want like a more detailed rundown, there was a really good article about it in Vice Motherboard, just kind of laying out the situation. I think fairness and accuracy in reporting have also done a little piece about the issue, giving an overview. But put simply, like I was commissioned to perform an interview with Judith Butler. And I interviewed them. Originally, it was going to be for the Guardian US, but I think it became a little bit confused as things continued. So having completed this interview and rewritten it with a view towards kind of making things as introductory and welcoming to people who are not familiar with theory as possible, the final 4 paragraphs of this interview got sliced out of the piece after publication. So they put it up on the website. I think the version that went out in the printed copy, and then the website itself kind of had these final passages removed because these were taken to be a bit too spicy for The Guardian. And specifically, they were addressing the so-called gender critical feminist movement. I don't really know which feminists aren't gender critical, but that's what they call themselves. So gender critical feminists were kind of addressed as part of the broader anti-gender movement. And specifically, what Butler had to say was that we couldn't really rely on anti-gender or gender critical feminists in opposing fascism. So this was removed due to the basically the incidence of a particular legal case, which when I was performing the interview wasn't actually a legal case. And then somebody was charged, and therefore there are specific restrictions, which especially British publications take into account when they are putting things online. So basically my question made a reference to this WeSpa incident. And for this reason, they use this as kind of as a pretext to remove the whole question and answer, which was pretty unfortunate given the answer wasn't really focusing on it, but there we go. Anyway, so I was sort of left in the strange position of having to explain to a lot of people what happened, because the original account they offered was extremely vague. I think they had this really cryptic thing they put to explain the edit. And of course, by the time I was actually offline for a few hours, and then by the time I got off I got back onto Twitter, I saw like hundreds of people had shared this passage and were tagging me. I had like half a dozen DMs from different journalists, and then more were coming in. So I had found myself in the middle of this kind of furore. But on the bright side, it actually means that this critique Butler was offering was read by a much broader audience than I think it would have been otherwise. I was kind of expecting this piece to be like beloved by people who like gender theory and queer stuff, and kind of loathed by people who don't like those things. But instead, it got a much broader, unexpectedly large audience.
Absolutely. And Judith's God tier sobriety and clarity in that piece was just the perfect thing to be amplified, I think, in this instance.
Yeah, I feel like well, I feel like that's definitely true both of this one piece where all they say is that we can't count on these anti-gender, like anyone describing themselves as anti-gender is probably not going to be anti-fascist in a meaningful way. That's basically all they say. And I think the responses to this furore especially kind of seem to show that up. But maybe that's something to discuss for another day. But yeah, I hope people read if you want to read the full thing, it's on Ill Will. Mm-hmm. I also put a section of it up on my Patreon. The censored version is still up on The Guardian, so you can read them talk about thinkers like Olufemi Otayo and Acid Hyder and other very interesting people who kind of like I'm interested in like bringing into dialogue a bit more. So maybe this can be the start of some conversations rather than just an online clusterfuck. Well. Absolutely. One last thing I'll say is I find it kind of funny that this is the one time I wasn't trolling. Like I'm definitely quite a provocative thinker. You don't put out a book called Transgender Marxism oblivious to the provocative potential.
Well, now that it's published, it's back to business as usual. Right?
This time around, I was just hoping to. Anyway, so.
Well, let's talk first a little bit about the intro to the book and the concept of the book, Transgender Marxism. The sort of guiding question to get us started is, why Marx? Why Marxism? What does Marxism have to offer to the imperative of trans liberation?
I think the reason that Marxism is something which many trans people have found themselves turning to, and the reason that so many people, the reason we're able to put together this collection quite so easily is that there's always a need to like get your abstractions in order. And anytime you try and really like isolate a topic, other things like tend to start appearing. And this is a point we'll kind of return to, I guess, when we talk about my own essay. The reality like of trans existence is that anything you try and identify as like exclusively to do with this one thing kind of crops up, or it manifests itself in other ways as well, in different ways, which we explore during the book. A lot of the political activities which trans people find themselves plunged into, trans people and supporters, I suppose, are often struggles sort of survival under our current capitalist conditions, like workplace struggles, the standard issue kind of class war stuff, which would impact anyone else. But these are kind of like struggles, and these are situations which trans people tend to encounter in a way which is simultaneously because of whatever gender position they happen to be in or are moving between, but also in ways which are like unmistakably marked out and kind of conditioned both by their kind of existence as proletarians and as trans people. So those are two things which sort of like have to be tackled at once. And especially like, anyway, there's some more things to say about the exact type of Marxism we have in mind. But I think that's kind of like the basics of it. It's that a lot of the ways that trans life ends up sucking or destroying us is to do with proletarian existence, and a lot of the way out of that is kind of to do with solidarity, class war, and so on. However, like there's simultaneously like a need to turn to Marx, but also like a lot of the time there's like a need not to drop the particularity out of that situation either. So that's, I guess, why transgender and Marxism kind of appear together for us. It's
really imperative as well to think about the way you and Elle say this in the intro, that it's not about bringing a transgender Marxism into being, but it's of collecting these intensities, these points of where the immanent critique that is Marxism is found in this intersection with gender theory and with the transgender experience as predominantly one of some people in the very strongest margins, almost highest intensities of proletarianization. And it's to drop the tie in a bit early, I really like what I'd like to describe as a kind of the Marxist outlook of the book seems to be a kind of base materialism versus what many could term sort of the vulgar materialism of certain strains of Marxism, that tend to, see things in terms of everything. Not a class first, or I don't want to say class reductionist, because that's a kind of a spicy term. It's the idea of, rather than having this theory as this transcendent horizon, as the eagle, as it says in the introduction, that swoops down and then kills the bigger eagle, capitalism. It's about finding capital's margins, finding capital's little underground, its base, and then undermining it so that it can't even reproduce itself. It's sort of collapsing underneath. And I guess one question is sort of, where does this battalion view of the base, of the grounds, come into the kind of Marxism that the book is trying to sort of collect in terms of the intensities of the trans and proletarian experience as they intersect?
Yeah, so the bit of the intro you're referencing is part of Bataille's criticism of surrealism, and his critique comes from this essay where he's trying to talk about the exact prefix "sur," so this "sur," the getting over something, and he's talking about specifically what Marx did, which previous anti-imperialists, I think that's the term that he uses, previous anti-imperialists kind of tried to take a more sort of commanding, like distancing, dominating from above kind of view, and Marx's approach was more to focus on the old mole, on the kind of burrowing like subterranean, like the exact opposite of an eagle, basically. And specifically, Bataille talks about the guts of the proletariat and the hungry stomachs, and this is what like Marx tries to put centrally instead. And that's base materialism, or like vulgar materialism, is definitely what we were trying to kind of put out there and kind of develop in this way, which is exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. The risk of like the risk accompanying like talking about class or putting class first or whatever is exactly that we end up with a materialism that sort of just like reduces everything literally down to the wage packet, and kind of like tries to set aside the actual feelings, impulses, like reactions, which actually accompany any kind of class war. Yeah, this is definitely what we were hoping to do. And that's kind of the reason that, I suppose that's the reason especially why we kind of permitted and allowed for so many different perspectives and so many different approaches, so many different styles of writing to kind of be included in this connection. Because I don't really think there's ever going to be a commanding overview of this topic, although the introduction kind of tries to provide an entry point, at least, so like a way into the other perspectives.
And you explicitly state this in the co-written intro as just fundamentally denying or just skirting around those readings of Marx that reject the corporeal. And it seems to me that like this reinvestment in both like embodiment and like corporeality, this desire to like in some sense to reach some sort of transcendence above it, to go beyond the base material, is in a kind of certain sense part of the problem with a lot of like contemporary economistic readings of Marx that tend to like devalue the function and the role of the body. So what I kind of uniquely appreciate about this intro, and we get a lot of it in your specific essay, but also in others, particularly the one about disability theory too, where the corporeal gets re-entered into conventional Marxist discourse. And one line that I really appreciated in the intro, I think it's page 2 or 3. Apologies, I'm like struggling with this book underneath the microphone. But there is this one passage where it becomes kind of explicitly clear that transitions occur, but they don't fundamentally belong to capital. And there seems to be an important distinction between events that occur within like a capitalist space and time, and events and movements corporeally that can belong, like labor, right, can belong to these processes. So maybe a better way for me to start to understand this would be to ask the reverse question, which is, what particularly can trans studies, queer theory, crip theory provide to these more vulgar Marxist analyses that don't just get tossed away as they often do in kind of particular Marxist circles as social inquiry or something like that?
Let me just begin with the corporeal, and then I'll get back to your ending question, which is also very interesting and provocative. So this question of the corporeal and like the embodied form as this appears in Marx is something which like both myself and Elle have kind of had as a frustration for a while, because like both reading Capital or reading whatever else you want to read by Marx, and also recent scholarship, like this is something which like in recent years there's been quite a volume of stuff about, and a lot of Marx's writing is very much drenched in metaphors of embodiment, whether he talks about eras being birthed, what G.A. Cohen calls the obstetric metaphor of like one era being birthed by the next, or whether there's this essay by Keston Sutherland which exactly talks about the term galata, which is like this gelatine paste, which is referenced by Marx during his description of abstract labor and like the state of kind of reduction of workers down to this kind of liquefied form. Other Marxologists, I suppose, like Maya Gonzalez and Nicole Pepperell, are also kind of readers of Marx who we sort of had in mind, and they are very, very kind of emphatic about Marx's approach as this kind of like constantly parodying, constantly providing these metaphors, which draw us back to the reality of capitalist existence and the reality of how capitalist economies operate, sort of stripping away through this parody and through this metaphor the kind of niceties and the euphemisms of previously existing political economies. So like the corporeal and like the bodily, I think that's like for anyone who's read Marx, I think it's hard to really miss it, not to cast aspersions on any fast socialists, of course. That's kind of the approach we were trying to take, and I think that's the approach which comes across in this introduction. Now, concerning like gender theory and grip and queer theory, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, so I think in some ways what we see, and like I share the sympathy that it's really, really hard to miss the function of the corporeal in Marx, like whether it's just on cooperation, the working day. There's one section in large scale industry where Marx breaks down like the fibers of the body and how the body, that there is a becoming of the factory worker. This whole notion that like inquiries that exist outside of an economistic apprehension of labor processes and production, that this assertion that it sort of thwarts the broader critique, right? Which is this, and we must start from a point of purely based in superstructure, and then we can move into these subfields of inquiry. They're already present in the initial analysis. So I think there's an intensity that I appreciate there. But my question has always been one where it always seems to me that, at least when I do work in disability studies, for example, like I always have to try to like temper the Marx and be like, oh no, it's like totally like valuable to what you guys are doing. Like and I, in a certain sense, I get like exhausted by having to make those sorts of demands that there be value to anti-capitalist discourse in discussions by, let's say, Stryker or Tobin Siebers, or like all these different fields that deal with the body and deal with like even just phenomenology of embodiment and things like that. So like the question for me is, now that we're seeing and you make this really clear in your introduction that the function of this book is not to give birth to a transgender Marxism, because it's already rolling. It already exists. There's already a proliferation of discourses surrounding it. So I guess one of my questions would be like, with this, what are some dialogical goals that you have about this book that will force an interaction between these class first, whatever that means, analyses of capital, and these discourses about gender, body, sex? Because I think that especially the final section of your essay in this volume, that final connection about from community to communism, it almost felt like it didn't need to necessarily be explicated, because it was already so obvious that all of these things were bound up in these discussions. So I guess the question would be, how can we force an interaction between these discussions on class and these discussions on trans queer embodiment as well.
Thanks a lot. Well, that's yeah, that's really. Maybe let me let me phrase this back to you and see how we do. So I guess the way I what you've kind of said here is the way I would take that is like, it seems like definitely in academia and in academic spaces, there's this kind of wariness around speaking about class, and especially this term you've used, like class reductionist, is saying that people move into very quickly if you try and offer systemic critiques. And this is even true in many circles which kind of style themselves as providing radical criticisms, providing like the deconstruction of existing societies and all of that. So on the one hand, existing in sort of like academic and similarly like NGO kind of spaces, while upholding or like developing an anti-capitalist viewpoint is a very precarious business, especially given the often ruthlessly competitive nature of these fields and these workplaces, right? And equally, within left-wing spaces, there's this real difficulty for any kind of queer, gender, trans critique and sort of developing that, especially for people who are in these actual positions, because very often there's this sense that like what the left wants you to provide is either something which is like supportive and something which is like transgender people are suffering and this is why capitalism is bad and we have to get rid of it, or they want something which is like specifically like a critique, like, okay, well, I am a transgender person, I'm an intersex person, I'm a bisexual, and here is my viewpoint on how we can develop our things, and here are my criticisms based from my own experiences and my own whatever. And in their own way, each of these things which the left very often demands from trans people requires this kind of subordination or self-tokenization, and especially often places people within these groups in the position of being like the token trans person, like offering a transgender viewpoint. You see what I mean? So the way in which this collection was aiming to do something very different to that was firstly that it doesn't really belong to academia at all. I mean, it was put out by a left-wing publishing house. I'm pretty sure the majority of the contributors have some kind of academic training. I think we've got like some university dropouts and stuff, some people who are adjuncts, but we don't really have any university professors except for Jordi Rosenberg, who provides the afterword, which was very kind of him. But for the most part, it's not really a work of like, I guess it's a work of scholarship in a way, but it's not something which is primarily there to kind of further academic CVs or anything like that. So this was sort of the freedom we were offered, but also this is the way that the type of trans studies, if you will, we're talking about was developing anyway. So this was something which you would find in zines and social media posts and all of these ephemeral, I think ephemeral is the word we use in the introduction, these kind of fading by the day kind of mediums, which are in fact constantly accelerating, you know, with the Instagram vanishing stories for like, or whatever else, these kind of like very disposable and swiftly vanishing format. So yeah, what we were hoping to do by putting it into a book was to generate something a lot more lasting and also something which could potentially even be canonical. So something which lots of people have read and are able to discuss around. So that's one of the things. And the final thing is like to just address this first problem, this idea of like, let's get our trans person to give us a trans critique. To address that kind of an issue, the hope with the book is that no one is really put in the position of having to just be like, okay, I'm a trans guy from this socioeconomic group, and here is what my life has been like. So there are two essays which do use this kind of confessional argumentation, but like they're using the confessional mode to like further their point in different ways in each of these essays, which I'm very happy to include. But no one is under the like obligation to be like, okay, well, I'm going to report in on what the situation is like here in New York City. You know what I mean? So that's kind of like that's, I suppose, what we were trying to get out of. To a greater or lesser extent, I guess this is very much a book about the flight from academia and kind of like avoiding the circumstances where you get stuck or like sunk into these like exhausting and sort of fruitless exchanges, whether it's with your so-called comrades or with your faculty colleagues.
It's not about selling trans people as, you know, pre-made revolutionary comrades to lend this super ego. It's showing how, you know, how these struggles are already ongoing and these conversations are being had. So, you know, if certain Marxists don't want to get with this, you know, it's in a way it's their loss in some ways. And I think it does come across really well in one of my favorite parts of this book was the dialogue on Deleuze and gender difference. it's sort of conversation. I can imagine it being in some of our group chats. To be honest, it could just be a series of amazing posts.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I really love the revolutionary potential of the Spinoza's phrase, "We do not know yet what a body can do," which is really affirmed and given its like most radical weight there. But so yeah, sorry, Crash.
Like life is a work of art, it comes up in that conversation. So like these things are already rolling, irrespective of whether or not this Leninist superego adorns it with its vanguardist status. So these discourses are already occurring.
Yeah, this a dialogue on Deleuze and gender difference is by the Conspiratorial Association for the Advancement of Cultural Degeneracy, or CACT. And and this is kind of a case in point. So this is like a purpose-made collective, or like a pair of people who are talking these things through and trying to work these things out together. And that's what we've included in the book. And I think, as you say, this is an example of how a lot of these breakthroughs and a lot of this analysis actually takes place. And so it's kind of like inserted into our collection raw, if you will. Yeah, you can see one of the Conspiratorial Association in one of our webcast appearances. I think one of the first ones. There she shares some more kind of like historical background on like the colonial domination of Hydra and other stuff like that, which was sort of going on in the background of this piece. But as I say, like is there implicitly, but not not like spelled out, because perspectives from the global south shouldn't have to reduce themselves to that. You know what I mean? It's like we have to have actual theorists from all over the world, and that's what we were kind of determined to do here. So yeah.
There was a really interesting note in the intro that I want to highlight, and that maybe that will move us forward into talking about your essay specifically on how transitions happen. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll just read this section, and then I'll offer my comments on it. And hopefully that my comments will sort of springboard us into your focus. And I'm looking on page 9 of the introduction. It says at the top, much work remains to be done expanding the earthly, intestinal vision of Marx and his successors outwards, moving from the bowels towards the glands and receptors that make up the endocrine system. And I just want to pause there because I love the interjection of the intestinal digestive imagery, and now juxtaposing it with the endocrine system, or the endocrinal imagery, I guess we would say. Transition 2 must come to be understood by revolutionaries as a response to its own form of hunger, the longings that drive so many to reforge the lives for ourselves that leave us thoroughly proletarianized or cast out rendered surplus. And then here's the part that I like. Those cravings and caving-ins that clinicians have long attempted to desiccate under the catch-all term dysphoria. In truth, our moments of euphoric coping are enmeshed with the moments in which we are stuck dumb by gut-churning dread. These are the moments that define our everyday lives, the restless energies that produce for us new needs that can be difficult even to describe. And what I like about this is what it suggests is that the revolutionary process is not one which flattens ontologically and effectively the field of the revolutionaries, but it seeks to reach out and recover those intensities which are often excluded in what is purported to be the revolutionary process. And I wanted to take a look at the idea of dysphoria as it's used here. And I'm not sure if this was your section or Elle's, but maybe you can respond to either way. But there's a way in which we can sort of take Marx's idea that the laborer confronts capital twice, once in the workplace and once in the market. In a way, the trans person confronts the clinic once both in the diagnostic realm, but then also as it goes on to talk about how the idea of hormonal treatments are emphasized as something that the apparatus of capture under capitalism and the state seeks to seize upon. And so, because when I'm looking at the way that the term dysphoria is used here, it reminds me of some of the work that I'm doing on the work of James Hillman and the idea of pathology, how pathology as a clinical term is one that is roundly negative. But there's a way in which perhaps the idea of dysphoria might be thought of or interpreted outside of the clinical frame, can be used as one to sort of recover these revolutionary possibilities. What do you see that term doing with respect to what you've done in your work, and with the larger question of what is to be done, which I think your essay tends to address, with respect to the ways that transitioning is dealt with under capitalism. And if you need me to clarify anything there, please, by all means.
No, I think that's great. We kind of co-wrote all of this, really. So we were like, yeah, some of us wrote the first pass of it, and then we tried to rework everything together. So this is, however, something which I've been interested in a great deal lately, like the history of physiology, the endocrine revolution, if we can call it that, maybe a little bit grandiosely, but clearly, like an objective world historic breakthrough, like any way you look at it, like the discovery of the endocrine system, between the late 19th century and the mid 20th, although things kind of sped up quite a lot around the 1910s, 1920s. It was quite a short window of time. Beginning like in the later 19th century with like pulling the adrenal glands out of animals and discovering that they died, and then the discovery of stress hormones following onto that, followed into in the earlier 20th century, the discovery of one sex hormone after another in rather quick succession, mostly in Paris, Vienna, London, and various places in the United States. So this is quite like both in time and in the places working on these things, this is a pretty narrow but incredibly far-reaching set of breakthroughs. And this is increasingly something I want to like work a lot more with. I'm working on a book about hermaphrodites at the moment, so I didn't want to like put too much of this content into this book. But I'm very happy that you focus specifically on this overlap between like the guts and the endocrine system. So here's a fun. Is it a fun fact? It's a fun conceptual thing from the physiologists, which is that physiologists think that the intestines, your digestive system, something which passes through your digestive system is still effectively outside your body. So like something which is within your guts, intuitively, you think that thing can't really get much more inside you than once you've swallowed it. But from a physiological point of view, there's this, the whole point of digestion is that you have something that moves from inside your innards into the actual body itself. So this is the meaning of a hormone. So a hormone is an inner secretion. So it's something which is within the system. So I could chat about hormones for a while, but this is this is something which is a breakthrough any way you look at it. The one example I often use, I hope he doesn't mind, one of the best known gay men who are kind of critical of the trans movement, at this point somewhat obsessed with the topic, I think it's fair to say, is Andrew Sullivan, who's this kind of notorious gay Tory who's been around for a while, has done various kind of evil things in his career as a writer and editor. But he's also, as well as a prominent critic of transgenderism, he's someone who's written remarkably lucidly and sort of effusively about his experience using exogenous testosterone, which is not unusual for people living with HIV. But this, to me, sort of indicates that even people who have their doubts about transgender ideology, and even people who want to become political critics of the transgender movement, are nevertheless sort of riding the same wave of endocrinological breakthroughs, which we can find appearing in all sorts of things. Obviously, hormonal birth control is the most widely discussed and the most popularized example of this kind of thing. But clearly, like, any way you want to look at it, this is like a historical point of struggle and something which is ongoing. And so, although I didn't want to get into the whole anatomy, physiology 101 kind of thing in this introduction, through putting the kind of inner secretions and the guts, kind of linking them one to another from the tie into what we're trying to do, that's what I was hoping we would get at. And I really appreciate you kind of spelling out the theoretical stakes there. It makes me very pleased that people are spotting it, right?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think there's some really interesting philosophy to be done that's sort of heralded just in those few short sentences.
Oh, I really recommend, I guess like Ian Hacking is a pretty good person to start off with. But like the thing with this topic is there's a lot of interesting stuff written about it. There's also a lot of kind of like somewhat conspiratorial, whatever stuff, which kind of tries to reduce this down to a question of corporate profit, which can be true. It depends on the hormone. Like if we're talking insulin, clearly, yes. Like I think that there is obviously a corporate conspiracy around insulin, and the continued existence of diabetes is probably connected directly to it being so profitable. But we have to be a bit discerning. We can't just assume corporate profits where they're actually isn't much. And a lot of the figures involved in this endocrine revolution, I don't know, a lot of them weren't directly in the pay of any corporation. They were university researchers, which is obviously a compromised position in its own right. But anyway, that's perhaps enough about about that specific topic. Maybe we can move on.
Well, just to continue with this theme of the pathological, I think this is a good way to get into your essay and just the very framing of it itself, because you reject in the beginning, the etiological imperative of saying, why do gender transitions happen? It's about how. And it seems to, sort of calling back almost to our last episode, ontological insecurity, it seems like the very framing of the question as how takes it into the more social pragmatic sense rather than this question of why, why are, I mean, it is addressed later on in Zandra Metcalf's essay, why are we like this? And also, Zandra's music, one of the best noise artists around these days, check it out. But in terms of the framing of the very question itself, could you sort of talk a bit more about why you had to displace this questioning, this ontological questioning of the why, as a kind of a pathology that itself comes from a very transphobic and cis-normative position?
For sure. I would just like to second that Yuboa Zandra's music project is definitely one for any fans of noise music. We also have Kavera, who's a GABA DJ, contributing an essay to the collection. So we've got a few bits of trans noise in there. So this etiological point, I think, so this is kind of like framed in two ways. So basically in my essay itself, I begin with this quote from Julia Serano, who I think is notable for kind of identifying this as a problem, but also not really being able to escape it as kind of one of the concerns she repeatedly addresses. She used to have a website which was just called Trans Etiology, I think. So etiology, to explain the jargon a bit, is the source of an illness, or the origin point of the malaise, the reason someone's sick. Serano is kind of simultaneously like identifying this compulsion, this temptation to account for ourselves, and I think herself maybe not able to escape it, at least at this point in her career. But yeah, in terms of editing the book, we did I think the original plan was to end it with Zandra's essay, and then the first essay proper is Social Reproduction and Social Cognition by Noah Zazanis, and both of these essays are kind of trying to take us in the other direction and kind of say that we can't provide a separate account of why trans people exist and why cis people exist. Like, in a sense, the same circumstances are there for each of those populations, and they have no non-relational existence, right? So in terms of what I was trying to do with my own essay, how do gender transitions happen? In the current context, I think especially in Britain, this is something which people get endlessly bogged down in. It's this question, which is not even why do gender transitions happen, but actually like whether gender transitions can happen. Like, is it possible to change one's sex? Can we distinguish sex from gender in such a way that you're unable to change your sex, but maybe you can change your gender if you're lucky? Yeah, so I say let us set aside these questions for something more interesting, and that's that's something I feel a lot of the time. It's like, well, ultimately we could have endless discussions about whether this is possible and at what point it is. But I think it's more helpful to look at the accompanying social practices and the communities that have fostered those practices, because clearly, any way you look at it, this is a question of international interest and international debate. So there's something that's going on here that has allowed there to be this question, any way you look at it.
I don't know if you saw in the chat, but I kind of recast your first two paragraphs into, if we can raise the question of how, we can overcome the other's demand to know why. Not Nietzsche, but maybe Nietzsche, maybe Deleuze, but definitely Jules.
I suppose I'm flattered. I don't know.
It'll be on Goodreads.
Transgender Nietzscheanism is the next project, I promise.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, yes, please.
That'll definitely piss off the Nietzsche bros, but we'll do it.
They need to be pissed off. I mean, well, they're never not pissed off, but there we go. I mean, but I guess to sort of get into sort of the depths of your essays going forward, I mean, it builds around these two core conceptions of how do gender transitions happen. One on the individual model, which is, I really love the description of mastering the encounter, and then the description of the communal model in which identities are fostered through the productions of new forms of language and new forms of self-identification or self-recognition amongst the patterns of mutual recognition. just, I guess, to get the main philosophical sort of meat of the essay going, I was wondering if you could describe in a bit more detail these two modes of transition, and how they interrelate, how they map onto each other, and how they become sort of dialectically interdependent in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. So the first view, like mastery over the encounter and transition is an exercise about that. The simplest way to say it is that this one is mostly about apprehension. It's about the way that other people treat you, the way that other people receive you, and equally the way that you're treating and receiving yourself. But more the inward focus is more about the way you fashion yourself, the way you present yourself, the way you kind of prepare yourself or ready yourself for these interactions. So as I try and flag up in the second half of this section, this is something which has been run through many kind of infinite problematizations, critiques, urging people to sort of move beyond this kind of conception, this kind of a mindset, especially in radical trans politics is sort of like this is like almost an article of faith, or like a truism that nobody passes, or to use this double entendre from Matilda Bernstein Sycamore, I think. Anyway, this is kind of like something which is continuously people are asked to set aside and yet keep on returning to. And I think what I try and flag up in this section is that one of the reasons which this has such a stubborn persistence, and one of the reasons which it seems to be such a commonplace, is that like prevailing civil society, the state, clinical, to return to the clinics, medical professionals who are overseeing access to care, and through to bureaucrats who are overseeing like correcting birth certificates, passports, things like that. Each of these people have like an expectation that you are making an overt and like a determined effort to sort of play the part and to commit to this in a visible and overt way. So this is kind of like, this is part of the reason that this continues to be a compelling one, but I don't think it's really reducible to that. So this is sort of like, this is like the approach to transition, which I sort of use this now deleted, I think, set of remarks by Natalie Wynn. This was originally a piece written for the Pluto Press blog site, which I then rewrote for this collection. So it's kind of like the emphasis on kind of internet culture is partially the reason, but also I think that still to this day, I think this account of what Wynn is trying to do here is very much something which accounts for what a lot of people are going for. So let me just see if there's one particular passage I can read out. All right, so basically this is the most remarkable bit to me. Here Wynn says, really, I want them to call me a woman because it feels natural to do so, because I just seem like a woman to them. This is not something I can just demand, so a lot of the burden is on me. So the kind of like, the first remarkable thing to say about this is it treats transition as sort of an obligation, as like this burden or this kind of weight which has to be navigated. It's something which, which you navigate by addressing yourself, but you address yourself and reform yourself sort of in the expectation of these either everyday or ongoing social interactions which you've got. And so that's kind of like the one, that's sort of the first approach. And I also use a few more like scholarly sort of reiterations of that, like C.J. Hale, the first essay which I quote by C.J. Hale, where he tries to kind of like set out almost exhaustively an account of all of the different things which people associate with womanhood and manhood, and comes out with some interesting things from studies, including the fact that like to be apprehended as a woman, it seems to be like more important. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff in that study, which anyway, I guess I can talk about that later. But anyway, the issue is that so this is kind of like the first approach, I guess.
This falls into, in some ways, in opposition, and then in others, a second approach, which the function of recognition is totally different, and the way in which recognition operates seems to be kind of communal. And can you talk a little bit about how moving from this critique of the video essay, to this now second form, which sees community action as the foundation for modes of, and so you said in your previous answer that like internet communication is pervasive throughout this piece, and that might be a representation of like where you were putting the piece originally. But also these new forms of community can also allow for new ways in which we as subjects can develop. Trans folks, queer folks, and so on can develop too. So if you can talk about the function of the trans circle in this communal sense of how transitions happen, I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So the final thing to say about the first section, I guess, is that I guess I identify this as a pretty like an unwittingly Althusserian approach to looking at transitions, and I guess because I very strongly suspect that Natalie Wynn at least is not directly influenced by Althusser, and I beyond a shadow of a doubt, I suspect that most people that think about themselves this way are not familiar with him. But nevertheless, it's like it seems to me like this seems to be in keeping with that interpolative view of how social interactions go down. And I think this isn't a totally original thought to me. It's actually something which Judith Butler, to return to them, kind of talks about as one of the rival positions. I think she's got this paper back in the 1980s where she sort of outlines the Marxist view, which of course, as a 1980s social theorist, means the Althusserian view. Yeah, there's decidedly this sense that it tries to place the encounter and this moment, this aleatory moment, front and center in the overall picture of things. So I kind of I simultaneously, I can see why this is compelling. I can see why it actually does serve people very well. But when I sort of move things through into the community view, there's this change that happens between the way that you consider things when you are imagining a totally abstracted or a totally almost randomized person you're encountering, or the person on the street who you picture, and then the type of interactions which you have within circles and communities which are more knowing, which are more focused around the development of consciousness. So this is sort of what the second section of the essay tries to turn towards.
You also put forward very well the sort of the way of the anxiety of the other's gaze almost becomes a kind of panopticism of where everyone is being so self-critical. They can recognize all of these gender markers, which are in the abstract markers of gender, but in the sort of everyday other's gaze end up being something that most people don't notice. Ultimately, sort of the self-subjectivation of this individual mode of transition is really only complemented in sort of getting out of this panopticism, it seems, by way of the community, in which, as you put it, these most so-called freakish things become the most cliche in the context of the new language and you can articulate in this new communal sense. And one of the most fascinating things about the second part of this essay is the notion of retooling, the reconception of certain parts of the body in the leather daddy community, leather daddy sex acts. And I just wanted to ask you about the way in which this sort of has an implicit sort of theory of the biological, in which the biological can become sort of, the matter, the flesh, the body can become coextensive with its symbolicness, its symbolic function, the way that actually sort of undermines the more rigid conceptions of biology that especially transphobes tend to rely upon, just the bad sexology. And it really sort of underwrites the plasticity of both in the ways that they coextend. I mean, I'm dropping some heavy Malabou here, but I'm just wondering about what this function of retooling one's tool can say about the inherent plasticity of or the coextensiveness between the symbolic and what we typically think of as the biological, but not in this rigid, essentialist way, or in a way in which essence becomes rethought of, itself retooled, in a way that essence isn't as rigid because it has its own capacity to be, become different, become other, to be retooled essentially, within itself.
Yeah, you can never get enough Malabou, in my opinion. She doesn't feature a lot in the collection, but I'm a big fan. And I totally agree. I totally agree. Like, I think when a lot of people sort of assume a fixity which isn't necessarily there. And this section about the leather daddies, which is the second essay by C.J. Hale, which I use in this collection, How to Have Sex Without Women or Men, is the subtitle. There's this description specifically of the reassignation, the new reference point for body parts, for sexual acts, which is very much tied in with the kind of heavily stylized, let's say, relations which these communities are kind of fostering with each other, and the specific roles which someone might adopt over the course of a relationship or over the course of an evening, and the way that these two things together are kind of used to repurpose and, as you say, retool. I like that word. I wish I'd put that one in there. People's physical forms. Yeah, I think the exact joke, quote by C.J. Hale is also quite funny. I like the end of it. But there's other examples which kind of I reference about how this is like another, the different ways that people go about these approaches. And another example, I guess another point, it's not always exactly a bodily thing. It's often about, in conversations with other people who've gone through transitions, it's often like a different way of recalling your past and a different way of considering your life and your history in kind of a new light, when you consider that this is always something which was a latent feature of your life, even if it was maybe something which was not outwardly apparent, or indeed often not apparent to even you. In a way, I feel like this, what I try and do in this section is I set up a kind of hopeful, a slightly more hopeful and more kind of optimistic account, I would say. Well, that's how I interpret it. Maybe other people read it differently and think that this is all like degeneracy and horrifying and people inducing schizophrenic dysfunction in each other. Maybe that's your interpretation. That's also fine too. But what I was trying to do is kind of set up a sort of like I say, a more slightly hopeful account which focuses not only on these not only on these erotic reimaginings, but also the community level action and organizing which has sort of developed over the decades, which is the section I quote from Nevada, is kind of trying to get towards that. But having kind of been more optimistic and more maybe overly hopeful and rosy, I then kind of move into like the limitations which inevitably set in having communities which are forming new ethical lives in the context of capitalist relations and everything else that's bad.
I absolutely think it's a point of optimism to sort of, even the very active retooling, and you do use retooling in the book. Don't worry, I stole that. But the idea of seizing, in a way, one's own means of subjectivation after coming to a new sort of place of self-understanding. It feels like there's a kind of partial seizure of the means there, which brings forth that sort of more rallying cry of, we do not know yet what a body can do, because I can do this. I can not simply always accommodate myself to the other's recognition, but in a way exceed it in ways that I myself have directed. And plasticity is always dangerous. I always love it when Catherine talks about plasticity, and it's linked to the German plastic bomb, for the atom bombs, the plastic explosive difference that becomes revealed. And I think one of my favorite pieces of literature that pretty much enacts this, I really love, for example, Paul Preciado's Can the Monster Speak?
Right.
Which is a complete rejection of recognition, complete rejection of all these pseudo-biological bases.
Yeah.
Sort of lays it out on the table. I mean, the book, the sort of book that sort of comes, you have to put it out. You have to put it out. It's on fire the entire time. It's absolutely amazing in terms of this radical, almost battalion excess, which sort of levels the entire field and gives the prospect of, we can seize the ways in which we expend ourselves, both symbolically and the way we express ourselves biologically. Right. But I think, Will, did you have
I think that there was a fascinating point too made about how, just passing in one of the comments, there was a point about transtemporality, and what I like about this, and it is optimistic, and I think there really seems to be this second framework you propose, which functions in opposition to the recognition of the other based one, I think in some ways can account for a transtemporality, whereas the other framework is one where that temporality has to be repressed and pushed away, where, and I think you deal with this well in response to Wynn's video where the natural response of the other must imagine a temporal notion of the person as they exist in that interaction now, and that they can never have, never be, never exist in other modes other than that one way in which they're being apprehended now. Whereas this communal force is one that allows for subjectivities to be propelled in new ways, for these collectivities to change. And I think that your quip about, is this all just inducing schizophrenic tendencies in one another? Well, I would argue that that's what the factory floor does. I would argue that that's what the clinic does. I would argue your auto-induced schizophrenia is my subjectivation. Like there is this sort of battle line about what are the legitimated forms of life, what are the legitimated pathologies, and they're always in conflict with one another. And what I love about this transition from communities to communism is really it is about, and the limits that you provided about these, finding out who we truly are. Is there a truth to sex? Is there a truth to my it's this question of avoiding those problems, the ideological issues about why. And I think for that reason, I found this paper to close on a particularly compelling and relatively revolutionary note.
Yeah. So, my teasing about schizophrenia aside, I do have my own horse in this race. I do have my own perspective in terms of using terms in normative ways, which is that I'm mostly a semantic pragmatist. Like, that's primarily what I'm into. That's mostly what I do. And what that means in short is that communities always set their own rules and set their own approaches, develop their own approaches to using any given term. And no word is really meaningful outside of that kind of social process of institutionalities. So that's kind of my own position. But obviously the purpose of this essay was meant to be a bit more clarificatory and kind of making things clear and setting people off on giving some insight in a more sort of accessible and breezy style, perhaps. But that is the kind of underlying perspective on my side. It's that this is obviously not something which is limited to transgender experiences, and this is something which happens kind of continuously in all kinds of different ways. I think especially one overlapping experience I tend to bear in mind when I'm doing my social theorizing is the remarkable body of resources that I was told about by my sex worker friends prior to the advent of SESTA FOSTA, which is this United States legislation which made operating on the internet a much more difficult proposition for sex workers. And the kind of resources they were putting together were often blacklisting. So they often needed to develop lists of the clients who are cops first and foremost, but also clients who are dangerous guys and who had said threatening things or done shady shit that made people feel uncomfortable. Prior to SESTA FOSTA, there was, so I guess that was 2018, right? There was really remarkable resources, spreadsheets, stuff like that, which were distributed within communities. And it's obviously a lot of sex workers are also trans people, so there was an overlap, as I say, but it seemed to remind me a great deal of the kind of system of sort of informal referrals and kind of like knowing which doctors are going to give you shit and not give you the pills, and which ones are going to give you shit and they will, or the ones who are actually helpful and supportive, who are often seen of a minority. On the one hand, this is just, in a way, this has a kind of pre-revolutionary potential. It doesn't really do anything to transform the system itself or to improve healthcare overall, but it can mean the difference between a mortifying and frustrating experience or simply a waste of time and having your needs met. Well, this is something that happens all the time. Like I was speaking just the other day with another intersex person who was discussing just an experience from a fat phobic doctor who was trying to refuse them medical treatment on that basis. And this is something that you just kind of bear in mind, you know what I mean? If another person is asking you about a particular hospital, then I will have memory banked that piece of information to tell to them, you know what I mean? It's a lot of the time, it's not something which is happening completely purposefully. It's not necessarily happening as activism, which I think is a great benefit, and also why it seems to often work so well. well, I guess the word I would use here, getting back to the semantic pragmatism, is this is kind of like often a very reciprocal process. And even people who want to have nothing to do with this whatsoever, even people who are like, I don't really consider myself to be transgender anymore. I've had my surgeries and I want nothing to do with this stuff. Even people who are trying to operate at a great distance and are totally atomize themselves as far as possible. Even people in that position still have these resources to hand, and they still have them available, even if they want to do that in an entirely grazing kind of an approach. So this is like, I guess, like I was saying with the overall endocrine revolution, this is kind of clearly a world historic breakthrough, which is happening whether you like it or not, and whatever you think about it. So yeah, a lot of my theorizing as well. So this goes back to like the first kind of Marxist theorizing I was doing on this topic, this essay, Transition and Abolition. A lot of my theorizing is always like, it's always done with the agenda that I feel like most of the time, like hostile actors towards us provide a very hazy and a very unclear account of why it is there are so many more trans people and why it is that this is all happening. They talk in terms of trends, ideology, perhaps social contagion, but they never really get into this stuff which I'm talking about now, which is what I think is kind of the advantage of not being a phobe. I feel like I'm able to see see a lot more and provide an account which is clearly just like a better explanation. Yeah, I hope that this is like useful to people. That's kind of what I'm going for. We'll see. Yeah, so far people seem to have responded well.
Well, Jules, thank you. I just have one question to kind of take us out here. It involves the section in your essay called From Communities to Communism. And this is where we get Gleesonism cashed out, right? So I want to drill down, if there is such a thing, that is, but I'd like to drill down a little bit on some of the claims made at the end here and elaborate the answer to the question of what is to be done. You say in the beginning that, but either of these views, individual wriggling in the face of interpolation or community working up their own normative bedrock, ever be fully accepted for our purposes. And so just to sort of interpolate that on my own. So we're talking about the phenomenon of atomized struggle, transitions that are conducted in an atomized sort of way versus these sort of community facilities that you talk about in other places in the essay. And then jumping ahead, you say, for as long as trans people operate in the face of a capitalist state, we will break in two directions: atomized struggle and the fashioning of a trans-specific mode of civil society. And the way that I'm interpreting this here is the risk under, in attempting to transition under capitalism is this return to the question of who we are. This is something that you said almost at the very end of the essay, where, I don't know, it seems to me, at least in terms of using the dispersed internet communities and so forth, and the idea of a community creating itself from the bottom up. This seems in many senses preferable than, to undergoing transition in an atomized sort of way. But it seems that the specter of the tribunal as it exists under the state, under capitalism, will always come back in the form of a kind of episteme, who are we, versus this kind of techne, like what can we create? What can we become? And I don't know if it kind of seems to me like you're hedging a little bit at the end, with the exception of the fact that you say that our attempt to be revolutionaries must be roundly anti-capitalist. I mean, it seems to me that what's at stake here is eliminating the notion of a tribunal and affirming a form of self-subjectivation or seizing the means of subjectivity that don't rely upon a kind of confirmation from the outside, a tribunal, or even the act or force of recognition.
So this use of civil society, so this is I suppose this is following on from Hegel and various others who kind of distinguish between the civil society is specifically that thing which is particular in a way that the state tends not to be. So this is something which is like focused around a particular thing, a particular need, in this case, like a particular set of communities. And right, so this section, which I'm happy to describe as Gleesonism, why not? This is me kind of like there's a kind of struggle which I have to wage, and And I guess a kind of clarification within the clarification, which is that whenever you talk about communities too much, people will start calling you a communitarian. This is something which Alistair McIntyre, most notably, kind of went through and dealt with in his particular flair. So to try and kind of like draw a quick distinction there, I have this passage. I guess I can read you some out. So I say, every petty corruption, frustration, and normativity enforcing eccentricity finds itself empowered by the raw necessity of communal work to avoid trans life becoming heteronymous to the whims and outdated protocols of state provision. In other words, to exist on our own terms immediately follows through into ferocious rows about who exactly we are. The result is that trans communities are despised and relied upon by trans people in equal measure, and for the exact same reason. These ever imperfect and ad hoc circles of shared interest are the best and worst stopgap against the total immiseration provided by the existing capitalist division of labor. So this is the pessimistic sting to my community optimism, I suppose. And what I'm trying to say here is that, ultimately, this is not where we want to be. Like a list of the doctors who are not terrible, the 1 out of 20 doctors who are not terrible. This is ultimately no place to come to a rest and no place to reside. Like it's a creative and a remarkable work that needs to be reflected upon and like built from. But it is not certainly not sufficient in much the same way that, sex workers having to go through potentially being threatened or even brutalized by clients and then making a list of that after the event is not ideal. Like these are clearly we need a horizon which is more thoroughgoing and more emancipatory than the kind of like rearguard movements that I'm describing and looking at. And specifically, like I feel like this is why you have such a cyclical pattern around people immersing themselves in these cultures, scenes, organizations, and then sort of getting churned through, and often kind of shifting more towards this, as we said before, kind of like atomized, like distanced approach later on. Yeah, it's not only because life gets better, although sometimes it does. It's also simply to do with the kind of demands which this type of organizing, this type of like normative reordering places on people, and especially the continual, incessant categorical rows, which kind of tend to preoccupy these spaces. So yeah, that's like hopefully enough to show that my politics are communist rather than communitarian. I can only hope. That's ultimately like the abolition of capitalism is the destination, right? The reconciliation, which I suppose is another term for what I'm outlining here, is never going to truly suffice for emancipation.